Yo, it's Go, and welcome to the video. I'm going to go over a couple of tips for the 4 bosses in the Construct Wing. Starting with Patchwork, the target dummy boss. Since there's no real mechanics here, I'll just go over a standard rotation with a couple of hints and tips on timing of your cooldowns. So as far as the opener goes, you get your Fairy Fire out first. You could either Fairy Fire or Insect Swarm, and then swap one or the other. I prefer Fairy Fire first and then Insect Swarm. Most guilds lust right off the bat. If your guild is holding lust for 30 seconds into the fight for some reason, then don't pop your Treants right away, but I think the majority of guilds are popping lust within the first 5 to 8 seconds of the fight. So that's usually my third global, is Treants, to make sure that they're out before lust. If they're out after lust, they don't get the benefit, and that's the biggest way to increase your Treant damage. So following popping Force of Nature is Starfall, and I have a macro with Saronite Bomb and Starfall at the same time. So every minute it shares the same 1 minute cooldown, both of them, so I don't have to worry about it at all. Every time I Starfall, I know I'm going to throw a bomb out. So after that opener, begin to cast Wrath, wait until Lunar procs, and then hopefully you're an engineer. That's when you would pop your Hyperspeed Accelerator. And forgot to mention, if you are using Mark of the War Prisoner or like an on-use spell power trinket, pop that with your Starfall. Those usually have a longer cooldown, so in order to get more than one use out of it during the fight, I try to pop those as soon as I can, especially on Patchwork. Most of Patchwork's fights are about 2 minutes 30 seconds, so if you're holding on to it too late, you might not get full value of your second use. Alright, so Lunar has procced, you've got your Hyperspeed going, you're casting your Starfires. As soon as Lunar ends, I would refresh Insect Swarm. I'd let Lunar fall off, cast one extra Starfire that has a chance to proc Solar, and then Insect Swarm after that very first Starfire. If it procs Solar in the GCD of the Insect Swarm, then I move right into Wrath. If it doesn't, go back to casting Starfire until Solar procs. Then I use that same concept for Solar. As soon as Solar ends, I'll cast an extra Wrath or two, so those are still in the air. Refresh Insect Swarm again. If in that Insect Swarm GCD Lunar procs, then I go right into Starfires. If not, back to Wrath. I've never kept up Insect Swarm like full time or anything, like during eclipses and stuff. If I have a long eclipse phase, I always just pop it like once in between eclipses, and that's it. As far as potions go, I love popping Wild Magic before the fight starts, and then popping a second one during the fight. And when I use a second Wild Magic potion, I'm waiting for a Lunar phase, and then I'll pop Wild Magic. But I know a lot of people like the haste potions, so for a haste potion lover, you just pop that with the next available Lunar phase after your pre-pop cooldown comes off. As far as specs go, you can kind of tweak your spec for a pure single target fight, especially for Patchwork. Alkan Frenzy is not really going to proc on this unless you try extremely hard to cheese it and pull an extra ad from the previous room into the fight to get a proc. And for the most part, you don't really need like Omen of Clarity, as long as the fight time is pretty quick and you feel like you're comfortable on mana. So that's another point that you can kind of float around. You can take some points out of Typhoon and Gale Winds. So if you're interested in a pure single target spec, I'll put one in the description. The highest DPS Boomkin fight for this is 8750 with a fight length of about 2 minutes 10 seconds. On to Grobulus. Positioning on this boss is pretty key. Being in range so your Starfall is hitting the boss, because most likely you'll have the Glyph of Focus, can be a bit tricky, especially if the tank is really moving the boss to avoid the green puddles on the ground. So for this fight, I do like to have Typhoon, and if I have Typhoon, I like to have Gale Winds, just in case I get the debuff and I have to go back behind the raid, drop the debuff, and then get back. I can use that as like a movement global, and Typhoon does pretty decent damage. So if I've already got like Insect Swarm up and Moonfire, then I will Typhoon to get into position. Alkan Frenzy, not really going to proc on this fight. No point in having points in there. Damage from the slimes do not count towards your parse, but the splash damage done from a Starfall star hitting an ad and then hitting the boss will add a minimal amount of DPS, so you might get lucky and get a couple extra little bits of splash damage depending on when the ads are up. but I wouldn't hold Starfall just to try to get some extra damage from it that way. I like having points in Improved Moonfire for this in case I'm using it to move. It gives it a bit of extra damage, but just make sure every single time you're refreshing Insect Swarm, you're moving closer to the boss, so you're in range for Starfall when it comes off, and the boss just isn't out of range completely for your Starfires and Wraths. The top damage from Boomy on this fight so far is 8800 DPS with a fight length of 1 minute 26 seconds. The third boss is Gluth. Damage done to any of the adds on this fight don't count. No surprise. I think the biggest thing with this fight is your uptime. So being at the end of the tunnel with your tank, ready to fall off and start getting some GCDs out on the boss is very important. If you're lagging behind, like I have before, I've used dash in the tunnel, and then once I've dropped down out of the tunnel, you can use your nitro boost to get up towards the back of the room where the boss is going to be tanked for the remainder of the fight. But in the meantime, while you're moving, go through your standard opener, get your Fairy Fire, your Insect Swarm, pop your Treants, use your Starfall. Moonfire if you still need to move a little bit more, so this is another fight. Couple points in Improved Moonfire, I don't think really hurts you if you're using like a single target spec. And I want to say this week I did rip aggro on one of the skeletons, so I got an Alkin Frenzy proc that way, but other than that, Alkin Frenzy is not really going to proc. Not a big deal in this fight. More important is your uptime. The highest Boomy parse is 8750 with a fight length of about 1 minute 20 seconds. And the final boss in the Construct Quarter is Thaddeus. One of my favorite fights. Alkin Frenzy procs a ton on this fight. Definitely recommend putting some points in there for this. You're already seeing some big numbers with the polarity charges, so having an extra 10% on top of that makes for some pretty nice crits. So the first two little mini bosses, both of those count towards your parse. So hopefully you're on the side that doesn't have to throttle. Our raid group has been really great every week where, you know, one side doesn't really have to let off and throttle at all, so it's just, you know, full send on the first little ad. I like popping Treants here, Starfall as well. They'll be off cooldown for your first polarity. This fight length is usually over 4 minutes, so popping a Treant on the first ad allows for a second use during the fight, which I think gives more damage than if you just hold it for lust after the polarity comes out. So since that first ad does count, you know, popping a potion before the fight helps out. I like to use dash to get off of the platform, and then use nitro boosts if I'm switching polarities. So a big thing that's gonna help your parse is if you don't have to move and your polarity just stays the same the entire duration of the fight. If you do have to move and Insect Swarm is up, then pop your Moonfire. You can Typhoon. This is also when I try to use Innervate if Innervate's needed to give to an Arcane Mage on yourself, whatever. Use that while you're moving from the polarities. Also with Treants, once there's a polarity shift, even if I'm staying still, that's when I'll pop Treants out, as long as I'm not in an eclipse. And as a last resort, if everything is on cooldown, like your Starfall, your Treants, Innervate, all that stuff, and you're having to move, both dots are up, then Typhoon can be an option. So I like having Typhoon on this fight, but not a big deal. The top Boomy parse for Thaddeus is 11,600 DPS with a fight length just under 4 minutes. So one extra thing, one bonus thing for Thaddeus in particular, but you can use this for any other fight as well if you're an engineer, is the last bomb that you throw during the fight could be a sapper instead, and I've seen sapper crits for over 10k on Thaddeus. So the first couple uses of your bombs, Saronite, and then at the end of the fight, since it's a 5-minute cooldown for sappers, pop your sapper for your last bomb. And that's it for the Construct Quarter. Hope you're parsing well. If you have any questions on any of the boss fights, let me know down below.